Welcome to Season 5 of the Photoethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in our 12th and final episode of Season 5, we'll be talking with Melanie King about leaning into collaboration. Melanie is a working-class artist and curator originally from Manchester, UK. She's now based in Kent. She's the co-director of Super Collider, Lumen Studios, and founder of the London Alternative Photography Collective. Melanie is a lecturer in photography at Canterbury Christ Church University. She's recently completed her PhD at the Royal College of Art. She's the interim chair of the Royal College of Art Working Class Collective, and she's represented by the Land Art Agency. Can we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
I'm interested in the relationship between the environment, photography, and materiality. My work intends to highlight the intimate connection between photographic materials and the natural world. And as part of this, I'm currently researching a number of sustainable photographic processes to minimise the environmental aspects of my practice. So I've done this in several different ways. A recent project called Acquaintance explored the creative possibilities of botanical cyanotype toning and sustainable photographic processes. And it considered how location-specific sustainable processes can produce bodies of work that are materially connected to the landscape.
And I guess the idea of working sort of with these sustainable methods is a real ethical choice, right? It's a choice about how you're going to use materials and impact on the world. And I guess I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to that and what was your journey toward this sort of sustainable methods?
Firstly, when I was doing my PhD, I was thinking about the interconnectedness between nature and sustainable photographic processes. I was thinking about the interconnected nature between humans, the environment, and the cosmos. But I was working with quite unsustainable processes. And I was kind of working with standard developer, and I was working with silver, which is obviously mined and causes environmental impacts. And also because of that, it causes conflicts and is part of ongoing genocide. So it's all interconnected with that. And then I just started thinking about how I might be able to make my work more sustainable. And that's very much interconnected with Hannah Fletcher and the work that she's been doing, setting up the sustainable darkroom. So that kind of gave me an understanding of how it might be possible to make my practice more sustainable. And they were looking at everything from kind of plastic usage to reusing silver from existing areas, and thinking about how it's possible to find alternatives.
You mentioned a lot of things in there about sort of how wide-reaching a lot of these environmental considerations and also geopolitical considerations are with, how materials are created or mined. And I guess I wonder, how do you develop your awareness or learn about, where these things come from? Because I don't think that they're always very transparent.
Yeah, I think originally I was looking into Esther Leslie's liquid crystals, and I was also looking into Jussi Parikka's geology of media. And those kind of gave me an idea. And then from there, I was looking more into kind of news and journalism related to that, and just trying to find out more for myself. So as part of my PhD, I did an environmental impacts of photography section. And again, also that was influenced by research with Professor Michelle Henning. So there's lots of people who are kind of looking into that and looking into the environmental and political issues that photography is causing. And that kind of made me look a bit more into other kind of resources, shall we say, that are talking about these kind of issues.
Absolutely. So I guess, you mentioned as well with your PhD, research, it seems, forms a really important part of your practice. Could you maybe talk about that a little bit, about what does research look like in your practice and what role does that play for you?
Yeah, of course. So to begin with, I think I started out with research that then informs the practice. And then this is kind of pre-PhD. And then as I moved into the PhD, because I was doing practice-based research, then it was kind of more coming out of the practice itself. So going into the studio and trying to come to an understanding with the kind of materials that I'm using and having field work and walks and movement as part of the practice that then allow thoughts to form and to make connections and things like that. So it's much more of a kind of cyclical thing where before the PhD, I don't think I was working like that. I think I was working with a kind of research first practice coming out of the research, and now it's much more of a cycle, which I think is more sustainable and makes it kind of consistently ongoing, which is really nice. It's like new work coming out of other projects, and yeah, doesn't seem to be ending.
That's super interesting. Yeah, because I think a lot of the people that we've had on the podcast have talked about the importance of research for their work, but I think most people have spoken about it in a way that like the research first, educate themselves on maybe like the culture that they're going to be working within or the social issues that they are going to be working on, and then go and do the research. But I guess for your practice, would it be because are you more situated maybe within an arts practice? And maybe does that change the way that you approach research, or is that irrelevant?
Yeah, I would say that first and foremost, I am an artist. So the research definitely comes out of my experience as an artist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think there's something else that you mentioned that I really want to highlight, because you were talking about developing this approach, starting off working with like traditional developers and traditional chemistry, and then developing this approach to working more sustainably. And you mentioned like the likes of Hannah Fletcher, who we've interviewed on the podcast previously. And I think that there's something that I've observed sort of in that sort of sustainable darkroom or sustainable photography movement that I think is really beautiful, which has to do with information sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could maybe speak about that a little bit, because I feel like from my experience, sort of dipping my toes in that arena as well, it seems like people are very giving of knowledge, very giving of information, and really genuinely interested in just making the industry more sustainable. And I think that's really beautiful. So yeah, I don't know. There isn't really a question in that, but maybe you could speak to that.
Absolutely. So when I graduated in 2013 from my MA, I wanted to start a photography network called the London Alternative Photography Collective. And it was kind of born out of a frustration of people sharing their work in terms of like in an exhibition or online, but then not being very forthcoming about the processes. So I even asked to do like a workshop with someone on chlorophyll printing, and they were like, oh no, I've been working in the lab for a really long time and I don't want to share my skills, which is fair enough. But then I found out that it was simply a case of putting a transparency onto the leaf. And I thought that's a real shame, because I see kind of photography processes as something akin to painting, where you can take the same process, but depending on your concept and what you do with it, you can get so many different creative results. And it's a shame to kind of safeguard that knowledge. So as a reaction to that, I wanted to build like a skill sharing network, and I wanted to kind of celebrate people working with these different processes. And yeah, after doing that for a while, that kind of to build more and more, and lots more people got involved. And then fast forward to kind of 2020, Hannah became a co-director, and she formed Sustainable Darkroom, and was thinking about how these kind of skill sharing ideas can be a way to make the world more sustainable. And I think that's really important, because it benefits all of us to have a more sustainable photographic landscape. And it doesn't really make sense to kind of safeguard sustainable processes. So yeah, I think that's really important. And I think there's so many people working on different processes now that we're each kind of adding a little bit more to the puzzle, if that makes sense. Like we're each looking at one area and then people can kind of build on that. And ultimately it's having more of a sustainable impact on the world as more and more people learn. So I think that's fantastic. And also, I just think there's the power of collaboration as well. And that's something that I've really leaned into in the past 12 years, kind of thinking about different people's skills, different people's knowledge bases. I've worked a lot with scientists, I've worked a lot with other artists from different disciplines. And I think that's super important for kind of moving forward and having that kind of transdisciplinary research, how different disciplines can learn from one another.
Absolutely. Like I am such a big believer in that in terms of, well, first of all, I think, the collaborative aspects that you're describing and the skill sharing. So I think you put that really, really well. But as well, just the fact that like people from different disciplines are going to be bringing completely different ideas and completely different approaches. And the more that we can sort of break through our silos and work together, I think can result in really interesting things. Like I've done a bit of work with lectures in nursing or in public health, and it's like they're coming at it from such a different perspective, and it's really interesting. And together, it can be challenging though, I think sometimes to work with people in other disciplines. Like I don't know if you found it to be challenging to work with scientists, because that's a very different approach, I guess, than an artist's approach.
I haven't actually.
That's good. That's good.
My master's was in art and science. So I feel that kind of gave me a good basis from which to collaborate in the future. And I think partly that's because I've approached the collaborations as a collaboration, not as like scientific illustration, but where the scientists are creatively contributing as well, not having this kind of like exchange where it's transactional, but more thinking about the purpose of the project and how we can creatively form the project together, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I'm going to get a little bit off topic here, but I have to dig into this for my own curiosity. Something that I found when I was doing a project in the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Queen's University Belfast, and something that I found was that nursing students were not very trusting of their own ability to interpret art. And so I think it's really interesting when you say that, like, working with scientists who were also contributing creatively. And I wonder, how was that? Was that easy or was that challenging?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the scientists that I've worked with, particularly though. For example, a telescoping engineer called Theo Schlichter at the UCLO Observatory, he was doing film photography and he was also doing the engineering on a telescope. And when I approached him to do analog photographs on a telescope, he was really excited by the idea. He hadn't maybe thought about doing the two together. So for him, it was really exciting because he had that creative environment beforehand, but it was like a nice collaboration where we both felt we were getting something out of it. And similarly, Professor Leonani Alcancel, who I worked with on my precious metals project, she is a space engineer and a metallurgist. And she also has many analog cameras of her own and works with Polaroid and film. So again, she already had this kind of connection to analog photography. And I guess her curiosity was also piqued because it kind of went into other areas of her own research as well. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to kind of find out more about the creative aspects of people's personalities who you might not really think would have something like that.
Absolutely. And I think that everything that you're describing really makes me think about, to go back to that word collaboration, because it seems like you're saying, I think people can sometimes, I think we're all guilty of this. I know I've been guilty of this. We can be quite guarded of our ideas and we try to do it all ourselves sometimes. But it seems like you're really leaning into that idea of finding the people with expertise who can complement what you're doing and doing that in a shared way. And I think that does run counter maybe to, I think a lot of maybe personalities in photography. I think that sometimes, it can be a very like sort of lone wolf type of activity. And so I think that's really interesting. And it also makes me want to ask a little bit about how could you maybe describe how you approach those collaborations for maybe other people listening who would want to maybe find an academic who or a scientist who has a shared interest, but they don't really know how to approach them in a way that the academic will also feel a benefit in that?
Definitely. Again, kind of going back to my MA in art and science, I think before then, I hadn't really thought that it was possible to approach a scientist or an academic. I hadn't really thought that that was something that would be available to me. But then when I did the course and we had some kind of residencies with scientists in different areas, that kind of gave me the confidence when I did do my PhD to approach the scientists with, first of all, like a very specific idea. So that they could immediately read the email and be like, okay, I can do this or I can't do this, rather than something like vague, like I'd like to come to your lab and like look around and spend lots of time. Because I guess lots of scientists and astronomers, for example, don't have lots of available time. So if there's a very specific idea, I think that's always very helpful. And I think the second thing, again, is it being more of a collaboration and less of a kind of transactional, this is me illustrating your research type of thing. I think if there's some kind of philosophical research idea that you can explore together, or for example, with me and Leah, we were trying to find more efficient ways of reclaiming silver, for example, using existing research. Yeah, I think maybe having a very specific idea and leaning in more to that kind of collaborative approach would be my advice. And just to literally find the person that you want to work with and send them an email. It can be as simple as that.
Absolutely. And I wonder if, thinking about your practice over time, I wonder what kinds of ethical dilemmas do you encounter in the type of work that you do, or what types of dilemmas have you encountered and how have you negotiated them?
Well, this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, in that I was working in quite an unsustainable way in my practice previously. And as I went through the research, finding more out about the interconnections between the cosmos and the environment and humans, obviously I then started to come up against my own unsustainability of my own practice. So my response to that really was thinking about how to make my practice more sustainable. And yeah, I wish I'd kind of known more about the sustainability of photography a little bit earlier. Like, I think Caffeinol has been around since the 1990s. So it would have been good for me to have found that a little bit earlier.
Absolutely. I mean, I spoke with Nilupi Yasmin about this a little bit, about the distinction between like art and craft. And I wonder if there's maybe like a similar sort of like hierarchy that's drawn between like Caffeinol developers and like fine art. I don't know. And maybe that's why we don't encounter it maybe in photography school. Does that make sense? Is that a thing, or am I extrapolating?
As far as I understand it, I think it's just that Caffeinol wasn't as well known as the other developers. I don't know if it's about a hierarchy. I think there is some kind of mistrust in plant-based developers and things like that, which I think is, as far as I understand it, not something to worry about. I think they're just as reliable and can be just as good as standard developers.
I mean, I will say absolutely, as someone who attended one of your workshops, I got great results from the mint tea developer. So I think I probably, I still need more practice. I still work with it, but I still need more practice. But I think, that's definitely been proven through your work that like the way that you use it, it just demonstrates that like this is not an inferior method at all. It's really has so much potential. But it also makes me think of something that Hannah Fletcher said, which I thought was quite interesting, about how like we maybe also need to let go of our expectations of what a photograph should look like. And I was wondering if you wanted to speak to that at all, because I think that that's it's something that I've personally worked on for myself as well, that I was doing a lot with sustainable methods, and I was getting quite frustrated because I wasn't good enough at it, you know? And then I realized, actually, I don't know why I'm clinging to this idea of perfection. I don't know if that resonates.
Oh, absolutely. And I think for me, that is like the fundamental reason why I'm interested in analog photography processes. So I studied fine art from in my BA, and I would say that I'm an artist who uses analog photographic processes rather than a photographer, if I was to give a distinction. And I've always been really interested in materiality and the conjunction between materiality and the subject. And that's consistently all the way through my work as as a strand. So for me, working with analog photography processes, I'm thinking I'm not someone who's really obsessed with having like a perfect image or even having a completely fixed image. I'm more interested in, say, thinking about what the materials can say, and also leaning in a bit to the ephemerality of some of these processes, like anthotype or chlorophyll printing, for example. And that for me comes from thinking about artists such as like Andy Goldsworthy, for example, whose work isn't ever completely fixed, or David Nash, or yeah, these artists who, for them, the materiality of the work and the use of natural materials is essential, but it isn't something that needs to be fixed in a solid state. And I think for me, thinking about astronomy as well, I feel like materials and matter and energy, it's always transforming, always changing. And the artwork is kind of part of that for me, from my perspective.
Totally. Oh, I think it's so interesting because I think we do have a tendency to cling to things, right? And we have this idea of permanence, but nothing ultimately is permanent, right? And I guess also when we cling to that idea of permanence, that's probably part of what has landed us in the ecological mess that we're in right now. I would imagine that feels connected. Is that connected?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, when we talk about archival in photography, we're looking back to the beginning of photography, really. We don't know past like 200 years. We have an idea, but we don't know for certain. So I find that interesting as well. It's like how permanent is permanent, how archival is archival. Like, are we talking 100 years? Are we talking 1,000 years? Are we talking like a million years?
Mm, yeah, absolutely. No, that's really interesting. And why do you photograph what you photograph? Or why do you make art about the things that you make art about?
I was thinking about this yesterday, and on the weekend, I went to see Brian Cox in his Symphonic Horizons lecture. And he was talking about how Albert Einstein had a compass, and he was really fascinated with it as a child. And then he kind of reflected that as a grown up and why he was interested in that. And he said he's always been fascinated in kind of looking under the surface of things, and was interested in this idea of looking at things in depth and trying to find things that are deeply hidden. I've really badly paraphrased that, but it really speaks to me in terms of what I'm interested in. So, for example, my PhD is called Ancient Light, and it's about this idea of capturing light that's been traveling for thousands, if not millions of years. I think maybe when we look at the stars, we may sometimes kind of take that for granted. Oh, look, there's a star in the sky. But actually, it's light kind of taken thousands or millions of years to reach us. And then I also live in an area in Kent, and we have these amazing kind of chalk cliffs here. And something like chalk itself is very rare on a kind of global scale, but it's also basically sea creatures that have been deposited on the ground of the ocean floor and then built up over thousands and millions of years. And again, that's kind of looking into the fabric of the materiality of the landscape. So for me, it is about thinking about, again, this kind of interconnectedness between nature and the cosmos and the environment. And when I'm working with the subject, for example, my recent project, Submerged Landscapes, is looking about how these landscapes might, in between 10 and 100 years, be submerged under the sea again, as they once were. So kind of thinking about that kind of conceptual idea and visiting those landscapes, but also thinking about the connection between the materials that I'm using. So in that project, I'm working with seaweed developer, I'm working with sea spinach, I'm working with seawater. I'm always thinking about how I can tell the story, not only through the subject, but through the materials that I'm using, and to try and do that in a sustainable way as well. Because obviously I don't want to contribute to the destruction of the environment as much as possible.
Absolutely. And I feel like that totally goes back to that idea of impermanence, doesn't it? But it's funny too what you're saying about like how ancient the light is that comes from the stars. It's like, well, maybe, I mean, that's as close to impermanence as we can get, I guess, is the light from the stars, which is, there's something, I don't know, very poetic about that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, but also that I'm trying to capture it and I'm trying to fix it. And there's something interesting in that as well, I guess. Like I'm trying to interact with it in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's gone this whole way. And I guess that's its like stopping point is when it hits the ground of the earth, right? And then trying to prolong that, I guess.
Or like even just the retina of our eyes. That's incredible, isn't it? Like it's traveled all that way and it goes into our eyes. And yeah, I find that really fascinating as well.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And is there any one common myth about photography that you would want to debunk?
Yeah, I was thinking about this yesterday as well. I think one of the things was thinking about is kind of going back to my background, and I kind of didn't necessarily think that I would be an artist or a photographer because I'm working class. So I guess one common myth is that you have to be rich to do it, or you have to have connected parents to do it. And something that I'd like to do in the future is to set up a working class photography collective as well, which I think would be really interesting just to see the different topics and the different artworks that working class photographers are making.
Is there anything that you wish that you had known when you started out? I know that you mentioned that you wish that you'd known more about Cathanol, but I wonder like what other resources have been useful to you as you've developed your practice?
So one of the things I wish I'd known when I'd started out is the wealth divide between some artists and photographers. So I think when I started out, I hadn't really realized how many artists were kind of from wealthy or learned parents, and people who maybe had parents who had a creative background or were coming from lots of money. And I think had I known that earlier on, I might have been less hard on myself in terms of going forward. And I think sometimes I felt like it was a bad thing to have a job on the side of doing my practice. But I think that's really important, kind of moving forward. For me, it's always very useful to have kind of part-time work to supplement my work. And it also made me have a bit more creative ownership over my own practice. And in terms of sustainability, I wish I'd known more about sustainable processes from the start. Because I've obviously made quite a lot of work practically, and it horrifies me really to think about the materials that I might have used and things like that previously. And kind of going on to resources, when I finished my MA, I was part of UAL's Arts Temp. So I think temp agencies that are within universities can be really useful when graduating. What's been really useful recently is the Royal College of Art Working Class Collective. And so I finished my PhD now, but that was really brilliant in the past 4 years to kind of have that online group to share frustrations, to share resources, to share ideas, and also things like the Working Class Creative Database. And then connected to that as well, the White Pube Funding Library has been absolutely brilliant. Not only does it have successful Arts Council applications on there that you can use as a template, it also has PhD funding applications, which actually helped one of my friends to get funding for her PhD. And then things like Curator Space and Arts Jobs, where you can find out about opportunities, sometimes funded, sometimes kind of collaborative, sometimes commissions. Those things have been really invaluable for me to kind of find my groove kind of creatively.
The last question that I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
The first word that jumped into my mind was care. So I think it makes me think, does my artwork, does my photography cause harm to anyone? Does it cause harm to the environment? Is there a way that my practice or my work can contribute to the care of others, to the care of the environment? So I think that would be my kind of first thought when I was thinking about the ethics of photography, and just to make sure that the work that we're doing is not causing harm in any way. I think that's very vague, but I think for me, it can connect to the sustainability of photography and the impact that photography can have on the environment.
This is the final episode in Season 5 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. You can stay connected with us online at www.photoethics.org or by following us on social media. We're on X, formerly known as Twitter, @PhotoEthics, and on Instagram @PhotoEthicsCenter. Thank you very much for joining me throughout Season 5. A final thank you to all of the guests this season, and to Luke Strong, who edited Season 5.